Good afternoon, and welcome to our first discussion, our first video discussion of the science of psychology. In this summer's science class, we are going to use the field of psychology as an introduction into the world of science. And so you've all got your textbooks, which are psychology textbooks, right? It's called Psychology: A Concise Introduction. And so what we're going to do is start right at chapter 1 and slowly make our way through the book. All right, we'll get probably through chapter 3 or so by the end of the summer. Now, what is psychology? By definition, psychology is really just the science of studying behavior and mental processes. But one of the things that is so difficult with this idea of psychology is that so many people have the idea that it's just a matter of laying down on a couch and telling people your problems. All right, that's not really what psychology is. That's counseling, all right, and therapy and that sort of thing. But in order to have successful counseling and successful therapy, there's got to be some kind of science behind it. There has to be data collection. There has to be, understanding of the processes by which all of this stuff works. All right. So those of you who are, dreaming of becoming a psychologist so that you can get everybody else to tell you their problems, I've got two things to say. First, there's a lot more to it than that. And secondly, most people who want to be psychologists are people who have serious internal problems themselves and are really just looking for answers to solve their own questions about themselves. But that's a whole different story. All right. The moral of the story is that therapy is only a very small portion of psychology. And if you really want to understand the idea of psychology itself, then you've got to understand the science behind it. All right. So therapy, again, just a very small portion of what goes on in psychology at all overall. Now, this section is entitled The Four Major Research Perspectives. And so what we're going to do in this video and the next two, there'll be three altogether for this, for chapter 1, section 1, is to talk about those four major research perspectives. And essentially what they are is four different ways that psychologists can look at a scenario of behavior or mental processes and try to figure out how exactly they come or they interact not only with each other, but with the behaviors that they're witnessing in a subject. So this is a list of the four major research perspectives, and we'll cover each of them in fairly great detail over the course of the next few minutes or so. But they are biological, cognitive, behavioral, and sociocultural. Now, the one thing, before we get into the individual details of each of these perspectives, what I do want you to understand is that they are all complementary. They're intertwined. They're interrelated. All right. A biological psychologist cannot ignore the behavioral side, and a sociocultural psychologist cannot ignore the cognitive side, and so on and so forth. All right. So they're all intertwined. But each of us in science has a favored perspective. All right. I'm a biologist, and so I tend to look at the biological and even maybe the cognitive as my major perspective. All right. But a social worker or a therapist might look at sociocultural or behavioral perspective in terms of their work. All right. And so, but again, no one of these four perspectives is any better than the others. All right, there's not one that's the best one, and psychologists will usually use more than one of them at the same time in order to get a complete picture of the subject, of the whatever they happen to be studying at the time. All right. Um, so biological, cognitive, behavioral, and sociocultural. Now, the first two on this list are what we call the internal factors, all right, biological and cognitive. These are the things that kind of come from within the human body, all right. We're talking here about the functioning of the nervous system and specifically the brain, and how the chemical reactions and signals that uh, are perceived by and interpreted by the brain um, have an effect on the behavior of the subject. Behavioral and sociocultural are perspectives that really are focused on the outside of the individual. What kinds of things, what kind of influences from outside the body are causing certain behaviors and certain processes here. Now, we'll start with the internal factors, all right? And specifically, in this case, we'll start with the biological factors, all right? By definition, the biological research perspective is a research perspective whose major explanatory focus, all right, in other words, how we explain everything, is how the brain and the nervous system and other physiological mechanisms, meaning the anatomy essentially, produce behavior and certain mental processes. In other words, the way somebody thinks. That's what I mean here by mental processes. How does somebody think? How do they come to the conclusions that they come to? And where this doesn't just include the brain and the spinal cord and the nervous system, right? But it can also include genetic information as well as evolutionary information. And we'll get to that in a little while. But overall, the biological research perspective is essentially a look at our physiological hardware, all right, the brain and the nervous system, all right, and a biological researcher will look at the brain and the spinal cord and the rest of the nervous system as the major determining factor of how someone behaves and what their mental processes are. All right, for example, a biological psychologist might look at the body's chemical imbalances. Um, uh, the brain chemistry, for example, might be a little off, and so they might try to diagnose and fix or cure or help someone who is depressed by looking at brain chemistry and perhaps prescribing a neurotransmitter or a drug that will alter that brain chemistry back to a somewhat more quote unquote normal outlook. All right. And so that's what a biological psychologist would do. Not concentrating so much on the outside factors that are causing the person to act or behave or think in a certain way, but rather what on the inside is causing this. What about the brain chemistry? What about that is what causing the patient or the person to think the way that they do. Okay. Now, the major biological components of psychology are the brain and the rest of the nervous system. Now, in chapter 3, I believe it is, we'll be talking in great detail about actually it's chapter 2, about neurobiology. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes here talking about this. But the nervous system is composed of cells which are called neurons. And neurons look like this cell that you see here. Okay. The neuron itself is composed of a cell body, and you can see the cell body here. They have dendrites, which are these long uh, branched extensions, and the dendrites are what receive signals from other neurons or from the eyeballs or the ears or some other sense organ. So the signals come in to the cell body, they're processed, and then if a signal is going to be sent from this neuron to the next one, it's going to run down this long tube called the axon. Okay. And so the dendrites receive information, the cell body processes information, and the axon sends a signal if required. Now, the brain, which is obviously found inside your skull, is a large collection of these neurons that you see in the picture on the left. All right, this is actually a photograph of a human brain. You can see it's divided into two hemispheres, two halves. In this particular person, the person's eyeballs would be here, and this would be the back of the skull over here. Now, the brain itself is composed of four major sections. You've got the brain stem, which is this long area, including this here, and it runs down into the spinal cord. You've got the diencephalon, which is essentially this area in here. All right. And the brainstem and the diencephalon tend to control the things that we don't generally think about consciously. Heart rate, respiratory rate, sweating, things that you don't, consciously think about when you try to turn them on or off. The third major piece is the cerebellum, which you see here. In this picture, it looks almost like a clover. And this is mostly for balancing the body. So it's responsible for motor coordination. All right. Athletes, hitting a baseball, putting a golf ball, riding a bicycle, those things tend to be controlled by the cerebellum. And then finally, the cerebrum is this big portion in here, and it tends to be very large in humans. But this is where most of the magic happens. This is where the processing of information really takes place. When you think, all right, where do your thoughts emanate from? Well, they emanate from the front of the cerebrum. All right, this is where your thoughts come from. Your soul exists. It certainly doesn't exist in your backside, nor does it exist in the backside of your brain. All right, but the frontal lobe of your brain is where all the magic actually happens. Now, the nervous system does not just consist of the brain and the spinal cord, although, of course, that's really the control center and why we refer to it as the central nervous system. And you can see that here. But the rest of the body is controlled by what we call the peripheral nervous system. And so the brain will receive and send signals back to the peripheral nervous system, and the spinal cord will do the same thing. There are cranial nerves in the head that connect to the eyeballs and the ears and the tongue and a few other places that control most of the senses. But there are also spinal nerves that control the touch from your fingers. All right, and notice that the tips of your fingers are connected to a spot on the spinal cord, not a spot directly in the brain. In any event, as you run down the spinal cord, you can see multiple branches, actually 32 branches of nerves that run through the trunk of the body, down into the legs, the arms, and so on. All right. And so there's a constant communication between the peripheral nervous system and the brain, and the spinal cord is the conduit that runs between them. Okay. Now, in terms of perspectives or other items that might influence the internal or the biological factors here, DNA, all right, our genetics play a major role in how our minds work and how we think. All right. This is, of course, also a major part of inheritance. And it is shown that in certain forms of depression, for example, that children can inherit, quote unquote, that type of depression. And if that's the case, if anything is inherited, then it's inherited through the molecule called DNA. All right. DNA is the hereditary molecule, and you are 50% your mother and 50% your father based on your DNA. In other words, your DNA, you have 46 chromosomes. 23 of them came from your dad, and 23 of them came from your mom. All right. And there's, no two ways about it. You may look more like your mom, or you may look more like your dad, or that sort of thing, but you're 50-50 there. Now, the other aspect in biology here is evolution. Okay, why are most people maybe not afraid of the dark, but a little less comfortable in a dark place than in a light place? All right, well, this is evolution. All right, the dark holds monsters. All right, and things that can eat you. Why are people scared of lightning? All right, even little babies. All right, yeah, the noise is scary and that kind of thing, but why does it upset them? All right, again, this has to do with evolution. Okay, now, SpongeBob, our friend here, is sponges are the simplest animals on Earth, and we certainly did not evolve at least not directly, from sponges. Although we probably shared a common ancestor way back when. But in terms of evolution, we do share a great deal of our DNA and our evolutionary history with organisms that are closely related to us, including gorillas and chimpanzees, but even going further back to dogs and cats and bears and that sort of thing. So, in any event, so that is, my friends, the end of the first of 3 videos on Chapter 1, or the first section of Chapter 1 in our textbooks. All right, and that it refers to the biological research perspective. Okay, stay tuned for video number 2, which is on the cognitive research perspective.